You weren't a hero, just some dusty old man wasting bar space. That's what the bartender said, loud enough for the whole place to hear, just moments before it all changed. The drink hadn't even dried on his face when someone opened the door and history walked in, dressed in silence and ready for reckoning. Before fists flew and the air cracked with shouts and broken chairs, before the veteran's name echoed off the walls louder than the jukebox ever had, he had just sat there, still and steady, like he'd seen worse in 100 different places with no names. And if you agree that dignity shouldn't come with an expiration date, especially not for those who carried it through war, like and subscribe, because what happens next might just make you rethink who you're sitting next to. The story didn't start with shouting, though. It started with silence. A roadside bar called Kenny's Taproom, tucked between a closed auto shop and a gas station that only took cash. The kind of place where regulars drank to forget, and newcomers were either ignored or tested. That night, the neon sign outside buzzed like it was on its last breath, and inside, the crowd was already rowdy before the rain hit the pavement. He came in just after sundown, wearing a faded army green windbreaker with a soft white collar and an old recon patch half-stitched above the heart. His name was Joseph Delaney, though nobody knew that yet. His hands, calloused but steady, rested on the bar like they'd been there before, just in different cities, different decades. He didn't order alcohol, just water with a lime. The bartender, Trey, young and slick with gelled hair and a backwards cap, smirked as he slid the drink down without making eye contact. "One fancy water for the silent type," he said, his voice dipped in sarcasm and swallowed by background laughter. Joe didn't respond. He simply nodded once in thanks and stared ahead at the wall of bottles like they were windows to another life. 2 stools down, a couple of guys chuckled into their beers. "Probably thinks he's still in the field," one said. "Bet he salutes his microwave," the other added. Joe sat through it all like a boulder in the current, unmoved. Behind the bar, Trey leaned in with mock sincerity. "You gonna drink that or interview it?" Still, Joe didn't flinch. He reached for his drink, took a sip, and set it back down with the kind of deliberate calm only men who've had to be quiet to survive understand. That's what made Trey do it. The stillness, the control, the nerve of it all. With a grin, Trey grabbed a cranberry soda from the soda gun, filled a glass, and without warning, threw it straight into Joe's face. "There," he laughed. "Red, white, and blue. You got your salute." For a split second, the bar went dead quiet. The music kept playing, but the patrons, every single one of them, watched to see what the old man would do. Joe didn't raise his voice. He just stood up slowly, his windbreaker now damp and dripping red, and walked past the stunned crowd to the restroom without a word. Some people started laughing again. Others just looked down. At the far end of the bar, a woman in scrubs, Lena, a night shift nurse and a former army medic, stood up, her chair scraping the floor. She followed Joe silently, the look in her eyes sharper than Trey had ever seen. A few minutes later, she came out, her expression hard. "That wasn't just some old man," she muttered to no one in particular. "That was Sergeant Major Delaney." At that name, a quiet shift rippled across the room. One man near the back, a bald-headed father with Marine tattoos on his forearms, stood up, looked at his son, and said, "Get your coat." His son looked confused. "Why?" The father's voice was low. "Because I served under that man, and we're not letting this stand." Trey, now puffed up from the laughter of a few drunk friends, leaned over the bar again. "You all taking this seriously? Come on. He's just some crank in a coat." But the door opened behind him, and Colonel Isaac Sawyer walked in. No fanfare, no uniform, just a crisp jacket, a military bearing you can't fake, and eyes that didn't blink. His voice cut through the growing noise like steel. "You just humiliated a war hero, son. You better apologize before this place forgets who taught you to stand." Trey scoffed. "What are you, his lawyer?" Colonel Sawyer stepped forward. "No, I'm the man who signed off on his last commendation." And just like that, the night wasn't about drinks or jokes anymore. It was about memory, about lines that shouldn't be crossed, and about a man who never needed to raise his voice to command a room. The storm hadn't started yet, but the clouds were already gathering. The seconds after Colonel Sawyer's words hung heavier than the neon haze in Kenny's taproom, a silence so sudden it felt like the jukebox forgot how to breathe, and Trey, once smug, now stiff, gripped the edge of the bar like it might ground him. The laughter was gone, replaced by stillness and something else, recognition, blooming in the eyes of people who'd only moments ago looked at Joseph Delaney like clutter, not legacy. And then the whispers started. Wait, did he say Sergeant Major Delaney? Someone near the pool table muttered. Another older man stood up slowly from a corner booth, lifting a ball cap that had hidden his salt and pepper crew cut, revealing the same recon insignia Joe wore, only his was inked into the skin of his forearm. I know that name, he said. That man pulled 2 of mine out of a minefield in Onbar. And like that, it spread, murmured reverence rolling through the room, from beer-soaked tabletops to bar backs who suddenly didn't want to be seen laughing. In the restroom, Joe had washed the soda from his face in silence, running water over his hands like he was cleansing ghosts. When he came back out, eyes sharp, collar damp, and spine straight as ever, he wasn't just an old man anymore. He was a lit fuse walking into a room full of dry kindling. He didn't speak, just walked to the end of the bar and sat back down on the same stool, the one now glistening with red soda and memory. Trey, unsure now, tried to recover his swagger. Look, I was just messing around, but Joe raised a hand gently, and the bartender stopped mid-sentence, because something about the gesture didn't feel like defeat. It felt like restraint. Colonel Sawyer stepped beside him and placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. This was the medal citation for his 3rd Distinguished Service Cross, he said, loud enough for the room to hear. You threw a drink at a man who once dragged a wounded gunner 6 miles under fire without a weapon, because he gave it to someone else first. Trey looked at the paper like it burned. How was I supposed to know? He snapped, now desperate. He didn't say anything. That was when Lena stepped forward, her voice quiet but scalpel sharp. Because real warriors don't advertise. They carry it. Then, from the back, the Marine father moved to the center of the room, pulled off his hoodie, and revealed his full dress tattoo. 2nd Recon, Bravo Company. His voice was calm but firm. Sergeant Major Delaney saved my CO when I was 19. You don't throw drinks at men who never let their team fall behind. His teenage son followed close behind, holding up a dog tag from his chain. He gave this to my dad. I wear it now. You disrespected all of us. The air shifted again, chairs squeaked, feet moved, and 6 more patrons stood up silently, most of them veterans, some still wearing civilian clothes like armor they didn't really believe in. One of them, tall, lean, and silent until now, set his beer down slowly. I served under Sawyer. That man sitting there trained our recon units in Alaska. You threw a drink on a man who taught soldiers how to survive sub-zero behind enemy lines. You think a cranberry splash is gonna shake him? Trey stammered, but his voice vanished beneath the scrape of boots. A pair of off-duty military police had just walked in, alerted by a text Lena sent 10 minutes ago. They didn't say anything either. Just stood by the door, arms folded, ready if needed. That was when Trey made his final mistake. He reached across the bar to snatch the paper Sawyer had laid down, like erasing it would change the truth it carried. But before his fingers touched it, a fist slammed into the bar top next to him. Not Joe's. Not Sawyer's. The Marine Dat's. Enough, he growled, and the sound of it shattered the last thread of control. Trey tried to shove the man back, but the crowd surged faster than he expected, not in chaos, but in defense, a wall of loyalty forged in desert heat and battlefield dust. Cheers flew. Glass broke. Someone screamed. And 5 seconds later, fists were flying. Not a bar fight. Not a brawl. It was a reckoning. Joe never swung once. He stood quietly and watched as the people who once ignored him now made clear they'd never let it happen again. Lena stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes locked on Trey, who was now pinned to the floor by 2 vets and being read a list of service medals he'd never understand. Colonel Sawyer finally spoke. This is why you never mock what you don't know. Because sometimes, what looks like silence is just discipline waiting to speak. Joe finally exhaled and took his seat again, and this time, no one sat higher than him. It only took 5 minutes for a room that had once laughed at an old man in a windbreaker to break wide open with fists, fury, and a long overdue correction. In the chaos, chairs clattered to the floor, the jukebox shorted out mid-song, and the bar's neon lights flickered like the place itself couldn't decide if it was still just a bar or now a battlefield of respect being reclaimed. Trey, once the loudest man in the room, now lay curled behind the bar, holding his jaw and spitting excuses through bloody teeth while the same hands he mocked held him down, not in rage, but in defense of a man who didn't raise his own. Joe Delaney had barely moved, save for wiping his brow once and folding his hands in his lap, like he was waiting for church to start. You're lucky, one of the vets growled as he knelt beside Trey. Because he wouldn't lift a hand to you. But we're not him. And there it was, The line between power and restraint. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about correction. A reminder that silence isn't weakness, and sometimes the loudest person in the room is the one who's earned the right to say nothing at all. When the cops arrived, there were no weapons drawn. No shouting. Just two older officers who had served once. Two, looking around and instantly understanding everything. One of them nodded toward Joe. "Sergeant Major Delaney?" he asked quietly. Joe nodded once. That was all. The officer tipped his hat and turned to Trey, still cowering. "You pressed charges?" Trey, swollen and ashamed, looked around at the eyes now boring into him, not with anger, but disappointment deeper than fists ever reached, and shook his head. "No, sir." "Good," the officer replied. "Because you'd be the only one walking out in cuffs if you did." Trey was escorted out, not arrested, but humiliated in the way only truth can manage. A truth he'd never forget. The crowd slowly settled. The chairs were righted. A few patrons picked up glass without being asked. The jukebox never restarted. It didn't have to. The real song had already been sung. And Joe? He stood up slowly and began to walk toward the door. Not in shame, not in victory. Just like a man who had stood long enough and knew when to let others carry the weight. But just before he reached the door, the bar owner, who had been away during the chaos, came sprinting in, breathless. "What happened?" he asked, looking around at the shattered bar and the blood on the floor. A dozen people spoke at once, but it was Lena who answered with perfect calm. "Someone forgot who they were serving," she said. The owner turned to Joe. "Is it true?" Joe just looked at him, then at the wall behind the bar, the only untouched space in the room. "You got room for a photo?" he asked quietly. "I've got one in a drawer. Some of my boys from Iraq. Be a better use of that space than neon beer ads." The owner nodded, still trying to piece it all together. "We'll put it up tonight." But Joe just smiled faintly. "Tomorrow's fine. I've waited this long." He stepped into the night, the storm finally breaking outside, rain falling in soft, forgiving sheets. As he walked into it, no one followed. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because they all knew now, he didn't need a crowd to be seen. The next night, the photo went up, right behind the bar, framed in thick oak, with a small brass plate beneath it that read, "Joseph Delaney, U.S. Army Recon. Distinguished Service Cross, X3. Always sat quiet. Until he didn't have to." And underneath that, in smaller script, one line, "Respect is the drink he ordered. We finally served it cold." From that day on, no one sat on Joe's stool unless they earned it. And if someone ever asked why, the bartender would just nod toward the photo and say, "You'll learn."